thank you for participating in this interview, Professor David Held. You're interested in a variety of research, primarily focusing on democratic theory and transactional and international democracy and globalization. What is it about politics on a global scale that interests you?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things that interest me on a global scale, but I think it's this really: is that if we were born 1,000 years ago, we would be called something like David, son of John the Carpenter, and you wouldn't have a full complex of names, and you wouldn't have a postal address, and you wouldn't know what the rulers of your country looked like, even if it had well-defined borders, which is unlikely, because you wouldn't see them on television and so on. And something has changed. I mean, the world has moved from being one that is highly specified in a local area to one where what happens in your locale can be affected by things across the other side of the world. We see this dramatically in instances like 9/11 or the development of the financial crisis and the downfall of the Lehman Brothers. But we see this in a much more subtle and intricate way. It's just in supermarkets. You go in there and there are goods from all over the world. Flowers have been flown in overnight from perhaps Nigeria. There's a global division of labor. And I think, in a nutshell, what interests me is that the international institutions we have were founded in 1945, and they froze a power structure that was the victor's power structure in 1945. Since then, the world has become increasingly enmeshed. Power is drifting to the east. Our institutions are increasingly unrepresentative and ineffective at the global level, but at just the time that we need them most, because of climate change, global financial issue, crisis, trade issues, and so on, nuclear proliferation. So the challenge of politics at the global level is about the fact that we live lives now that are increasingly enmeshed, that the communities are enmeshed with each other like never before, and we can measure that. And that poses new political questions and new philosophical questions, and these interest me greatly.
In your opinion, then, does institutional framework for democracy at the international level, or if not, how should things be changed then?
Well, as suggested already, really, I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. The UN system has always been a contradiction. On the one hand, the UN Charter framework and the subsequent, let's say, covenants of rights, right the way up to the foundation of the ICC, embed in legal terms what I would call cosmopolitan values, values concerned to protect the equal worth and dignity of every human being. These are rock-solid universal values. At the same time, it spliced these values together with the protection of sovereign interests, particularly the sovereign interests of the victors of 1945. I mean, today, if you were designing the UN system, would you give Britain and France a veto power on the Security Council? I mean, the idea is preposterous in the world in which we now live in, and yet that's precisely 2 of the 5 permanent members. So I think the UN system is inspired by the right values and does a lot of very good work, especially in the technical-based agencies that we hardly hear anything about. But the more the UN becomes concerned with distributional questions, issues of war and peace and so on, the more gridlocked it is today by the power structure that's embedded in it. And so, on the one hand, it's an inspiration and remains one, and it's the only set of institutions we have. On the other hand, it is deeply flawed, and those flaws are of greatest concern because we face a number of critical tests, not in the future, but these are for the future of humanity right now. Are we going to produce a global deal on climate change? Will we reform the structure, nature, and the dynamics of global financial markets? Will we produce a new Doha trade round that actually improves the terms and conditions for the least well-off countries? Can we stop nuclear proliferation? At the moment, the answer to all these questions looks to be no. And if that's true, then it seems to me the UN system will ossify and become less and less relevant to a world that's increasingly multipolar, where power is drifting to different countries and different regions of the world. And we see the gridlock that creates at the Copenhagen climate negotiations. Gridlock that produces stalemate. The alternative is to try and rebuild our institutions from the bottom up where we can, and that's the project that I pursue in my work, and I do it at different levels, philosophically, institutionally, and so on. But we live, I think, in very risk-laden times. When power shifts as fastly as it is doing now, institutions get unsettled and new elements of risk and uncertainty arise. And that is exactly the era in which we now live. And yet we need our institutions more than ever, because these cross-border issues that have been thrown up by globalization are urgently in need of being addressed.
So would you say that, especially with what you mentioned about recent times about it being so controversial, do you think that Barack Obama has been able to help or hinder global democracy?
Well, I'm a great fan of Barack Obama's. I think Barack Obama is an extraordinary politician who's come to power at the least opportune moment since 1945. He's probably the greatest president since 1945, but at the same time, he's came to power with the US debt, out of control, with the US economy stagnant and in crisis, with 2 wars, that he inherited.
Yeah.
And Congress is deadlocked. It's even before the recent congressional elections. The room for maneuver that he has is very limited. So I have a great deal of sympathy for him, and I have a great deal of concern about the meaning of democracy today, when we can clearly see the contrast between the deadlock structures of Washington and the capacity, let's say, of the Chinese to make things happen because they don't have to worry about democracy. Now, on the other hand, having said these positive things about Barack Obama, I think, something I sometimes ask my students to think about is under what principles of international law are drone attacks justified? Under his presidency, drone attacks have been doing a lot of damage, not just to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, in a way, he's caught in the power traps of geopolitics and geoeconomics, of which the US has been the hegemonic power for a very long time. Has he broken decisively with this? I think in his rhetoric, yes, but actually on the ground, he remains.
Do you think that perhaps realism could explain anything in contemporary international affairs, as opposed to cosmopolitanism?
Well, I like to drive some of my colleagues crazy by saying realism is dead, cosmopolitanism is the new realism. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek and ironic, but I'll tell you why I say it. The serious part of it is that what has failed in the last 20 years or so are key elements of what we might call Western global policy. The Washington Consensus, with the economic model that development depends on liberalization of markets on the one side and global market integration on the other, has clearly not produced the goods. The most successful developing countries in the world are the ones that didn't follow that model, and the ones that did were the ones that became most vulnerable. Who would have predicted 20 to 25 years ago that the most successful developing countries in the world would be China, India, Vietnam, and Africa, Uganda, among others? And the ones that most ardently followed that model, or had to follow the Washington Consensus model because of IMF and World Bank pressure, are the ones that did least well. So that's one set of issues. Market fundamentalism is dead. On the other hand, the security policies of predominantly of the West, let's call it the Anglo-American world, as the shorthand now, are also dead. The response to 9/11, in my view, was not just illegal, but deeply flawed in about every conceivable way. The greatest power in the world could not win in a small country, even like Iraq, and in Afghanistan it is stymied and will soon pull out. These wars and the war on terror had counter-beneficial results, not just unintended consequences, but counter-beneficial results for the powers that perpetrated them. And we see how, in a much more complex power structure that we live in today in the world, the pursuit of self-interest, the pursuit of military power, cannot produce the results on the ground. It cannot win hearts and minds and cannot win the peace. So the pursuit of economic self-interest through markets on the one side and the pursuit of coercive power through national interests and state interests on the other have run into the buffers. On the one hand, that creates a space. On the other hand, that's the very space I now say is so filled with uncertainty and risk. I think realism is a partial explanation for the multipolar world that we now live in. But it doesn't produce the policy framework for what is essential, which is the coordination of policy among states because they have common interests on critical areas, from finance to trade to health pandemics to the climate change.
With all the problems that you have mentioned, do you not think that cosmopolitanism could perhaps be overreaching its goal and is perhaps in some sense a little bit over-idealistic?
I hope so. I hope it's really idealistic. we live in an age of cynicism and pessimism where one can easily surrender to raising fees at universities, to believing that nothing can be done about the politics of the coalition, to thinking that on all these big issues, that nuclear proliferation is inevitable, that climate change can't be stopped. My work represents an attempt to say that the goods to think with, what the anthropologist Levi-Strauss once called, that our goods to think with can be changed. Our discourses can be changed. But, of course, one has to be realistic. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. The modern nation state, the concepts of the modern state, existed in the 16th and 17th century. But it took centuries for them to become embedded, even in some parts of the world. So you've got a system of power that was secular, separate from rule and ruled. Can we create a cosmopolitan world order, as it were, in a decade? Of course not. These things take vast shifts. But my argument is that we live increasingly in a global age, where the fate and fortunes of countries are increasingly enmeshed, and that where cosmopolitan gives us the right signposts for the kinds of change that are plausible and desirable in the world in which we go forward. But will this happen in a generation? Of course not. But there's a real problem. Many of the issues we've spoken about are not going to wait for 300 or 400 years.
Okay, thank you very much for those answers. It's been a pleasure talking to you.